Colleagues, before we pass on to discussion and you'll given the opportunity to ask your questions, I'd like to make two comments. My experience of relations with Mr. Passa is not that extensive as that of Lena, but we had a very interesting exchange last night. This was this was on a common acquaintance of ours, and Mr. Passa said that he is a great admirer of Professor Neustadt. He's the author of two books, translated into Russian, published by the Moscow School of Political Study. One is called The Presidential Power. This is a book which is widely studied in the contemporary colleges and universities. And his second book that we published, and this is something that we had a very interesting common ground with my dear speaker here, is on the use of how the decisions are taken. On the basis of some episodes of American history, the U.S. history, two American professors, one of them being Professor Neustadt, are trying to make out and find out how do the politicians succeed in evolving from some very precarious situations. You might really profit very much by reading both of the books of Professor Neustadt. This is just a personal remark I'd like to make. But I would also like to make a general remark. You indeed might have noticed that the Russian bookstores are indeed replete with books on negotiations, and a lot of publications. But unfortunately, most of these are concentrated in the business sections of these bookstores, thus concentrating on the negotiating the commercial transactions in the multitude of their manifestations, and with how much the Russians are taken away by the ideas of financial success today. It is not surprising. But we also have to remember that our society, which is split today, will have to find new ways of accord in the next several years. We need new technologies. We need new techniques and skills of negotiations. It is for this reason, I think, that we have had a most important presentation of Dr. Passa. And I shall now pass on to the question and answer session. Thank you. Sir, how could you comment on the trial and the arbitrage proceedings between Mr. Berezovsky and Mr. Abramovich, and how does the British public perceive this? Now, my second question or a remark is that negotiations are often predicated on tolerance. But what is to be done in a society like that of Russia, which is not as much prone for tolerance? Mr. Krigoroda from the Altai region.
Know the details of the trial a great deal, but the reaction of the British public and the British press is that their lawyers are making an enormous amount of money out of this for what seems to be really just a trial of two men's egos. So to me, it's a waste of the British legal time to play this out. Mm-hmm. I didn't hear, unfortunately, your second question because we were talking about
И я повторю, если позволите.
Yeah, if I may be allowed to repeat the second half of my question, the ability to hold negotiations is in many ways predicated upon tolerance and the ability to hear and understand the other side. My presumption is that this is tolerance is an asset which is very lacking in the Russian society today. What is to be done to try and change this?
I would reframe that in the sense that what is required is active listening, not tolerance. Right? You can disagree with a person without being disagreeable. Right? What people often don't do, though, is they don't fully listen to what someone is saying. They start talking, and within the first 30 seconds to a minute, start crafting the answer in their head. Right? It's that little voice in our head who says, oh no, here he goes again. Right? Same old line. So you immediately start coming up with your same old lines. Tolerance is civility. And you should be able, in a civil manner, to be able to listen to someone. For most of my journalistic career, I covered political negotiations. I started covering the Paris peace talks in the 1968. I did the Rhodesia talks in 1977, the Mideast talks in 73. And in each one of these negotiations, especially the Paris peace talks, the North Vietnamese insisted on spending weeks, not days or hours, but weeks, in recounting the history of the conflict, how they fought the Japanese, and then how they fought the French, and now they're fighting the Americans. They wanted the Americans to know where they were coming from. And originally, the American negotiators kept walking out. And so when they reconvened again, the North Vietnamese would start from word one all over again to make sure that they heard the thing over and over. You have to give someone a chance to tell their story. You have to give someone a chance to vent their anger or their opinion. And that's the tolerance. But you can use, when you study negotiation, especially in a political context, if you learn the technique of active listening, which is more than just nodding your head, going, or writing down everything that someone says like lawyers tend to do, and you actually listen to the conversation without answering back in your head, you'll find there's a wealth of information you can then turn around tactically and use by creatively calling them up on a certain point. You did this with a previous opponent. Why do you see us in the same way? Or how do you see us in the same way? So I think that the tolerance that you need is a personal discipline and understanding. If you walk into a room thinking you know all the answers, you shouldn't be in the room.
Так. Пожалуйста.
Anastasia from Tyumen region in Siberia. I have a fair idea of how the public and the government interact in Britain, as I lived in Britain for some time. Unfortunately, I do not see any of these mechanisms in place in Russia. But the question is, how are Russians, be it individually or in groups, under the conditions of an authoritarian regime, to hold negotiations? How is it possible for the Russians today to hold negotiations with the government?
I think you're actually, my reading of the situation, of the political situation here, is that if you buy into the notion that what happened in December was a solid crack in the veneer of the political establishment here, and if you buy into what Alexei mentioned, that the government is starting off from a weak position, I think you'll find that they're going to see it in their interest to engage with you. If they're unable to engage with you, they will crack down on you out of frustration. I think they realize, looking around the world, that no one is going to really tolerate a severe crackdown on or political repression the next time around. Russia just spent 20 years working itself into the WTO, for example, and they're going to be called upon to be able to say, listen, you insisted on being a member of this world body, you have to act like a member of the world body, or we'll suspend you, right? What I brought up earlier, the biggest threat that the United States and the Western people have, which will change the society here, which is why I believe there will be a dialogue, is because we've now shown how easy it is to freeze people's assets. And if you believe the stories, that are published in the press, roughly 40% of the income of this country is actually stashed in foreign bank accounts, right? If that's stopped unilaterally, the way it's being done with Syria, the way was done with Libya, power wouldn't last 5 minutes in this country. So he's going to know that he has to buy some kind of acceptance here. The other thing is, again, of his own making. You're going to host the Winter Olympics here in 2 years in Sochi. Russia is going to open itself up to the world. It's got to show that it's doing that. And there will be that added pressure coming both internally and externally to see some kind of dialogue or process. So the question really is, how do you engage in that dialogue? First of all, don't turn it down by being cynical and saying, this is all a front. He's not sincere in what he's doing. Sit opposite the table. Let him have his word. And then pick him up on those things. Okay? It doesn't happen in one day. It's a long, involved process. In 2000, I came here on a British government grant to set up mediation systems through your Ministry of Labor and Social Welfare. And the Oblast of Samara was chosen for the pilot project. And I spent 3 months there training judges and working with the social welfare people on how to hold mediations on social welfare issues. And then 6 months later, Putin got rid of all the regional governors. Now, the reason Samara was chosen was because it had a very forward-thinking regional government. It had been a closed city, which I didn't know, and it had 1,741 universities and technical schools, because it was the home of your space program and where the MiGs were made, your jet fighters. It was an extremely intelligent community, and that's probably why they were so forward-looking. There were so many professional people there that they knew there was another way of doing things. Well, this time, when you have the chance of having regional elections, you must mobilize, and you must make each campaign for each region part of that national debate. So I think that opportunity is going to come. You may not force him into rerunning the presidential elections. You might be able to force him into redoing the parliamentary ones once he feels that he's been in power for a year or so, and he can afford politically to take the risk to do that. He won't do it unless he thinks he can win, but that's not the point. The point is it'll give you an opportunity to show that there is the capability of an opposition, and you can engage in that debate. It's something kind of like what Gandhi taught his people when the riots broke out and an Indian family was killed by a group of Muslims. The surviving father, his kids had been killed. And he said, "What are we to do?" And he said, "Go out and find a Muslim child whose parents have been killed and adopt him as your own. And more importantly, raise him to be a Muslim." And that's how you show the tolerance to live in that kind of society. And that's the tolerance, maybe the word that you were using. I'm not sure of what is lost in translation in terms of the actual words, but that's how we demonstrate that kind of tolerance.
Сударыня, второй ряд, прошу.
Albina Troshina from Dagestan. This is not so much a question, but a comment or a remark which on the experience accumulated in the southernmost region of the Russian Federation on the topic of negotiations which are viewed as an absolute necessity for our region if it is to retain its ethno-cultural diversity. The negotiations in the Caucasus have been a factor of political life for centuries, and that is something that is now going on the civil level, and there's a big contribution made to this process by the alumni of the Moscow School of Political Studies. The generation of people which the 20-year-olds who were born after the breakup of the Soviet Union did not go through this quite secular and international Soviet educational system. But it is important to revive those good components which did exist in that educational system from the standpoint of the respect for the other. I would also like to mention the series of TV series based on the teachings and the philosophy of Karl Popper. These processes which we see in Dagestan are elevated to a higher level to the extent that the governments understand that such dialogue has to unfold between the different Northern Caucasian republics. I think in Ingushetia a commission has been set up to help social adaptation of people who participated in the civil war on the side of the separatists, but did not kill. They do not have blood on their hands. They were the supporters of the separatists, but they did not take part in the active combat. So this commission set up in Ingushetia is viewed as one of the instruments to help the social adaptation of such individuals. And this is, of course, a very important issue for all of the Northern Caucasian republics. And clearly, it is important for us to understand the importance of negotiations. Well, thank you for this very interesting remark from you about your experience.
Add one thing to that. Russian society is as you've discussed yesterday, is a very broad-based society, and you can actually contribute if you write about the experiences you've just talked about, and publish them, and hopefully also publish them internationally, so that we can all learn from that. Right? The power to spread that message lies with you.
Так, второй ряд, коллега, прошу.
Mr. Malyshev from Penza. You mentioned December of 2011 in Russia. Could you evolve a little bit, if you could, on your impressions about the Russian process in December of last year, and what mistakes were made by all parties?
Saying the civil service, that's beyond my pay grade to really comment on that. I can really only comment as far as what I watched on television. And I've made in total 10 trips to Russia over a 30-year period. So the little I know of your society. My first and foremost is that it would be, as I think pointed out yesterday, a mistake to think that what happened in December was a reenactment of Tahrir Square, even though television did show someone had walked into Red Square and had put a sign over the street thing saying Tahrir Square. It isn't. First of all, you're a far more sophisticated and more widely educated society than is going on in the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring also was first and foremost driven not by political ideology, but by economic necessity. Vast unemployment. About people between 16 to 24 years of age there is running about 50 to 60% unemployment. Basically, these people were saying to themselves, why am I bothering to get up in the morning and get out of bed? They have no future. Right? I don't think that's such a similar situation here. But what it does show, and even though when you watch English language version of RTL, they kept downplaying the numbers and saying, oh, well, it only looks like 10,000 people. How many do you think it looks like? Well, then I wouldn't even say as much as that, about 8,000 people. And then you'd read the Reuters screen, which says there are, 100,000 or 50,000. They were trying to play politics with the numbers. But what it showed, I think, first of all, to people in England, which something you would never find, we would never come out and protest anything at 20 degrees below zero weather. Right? We are, first and foremost, sunshine patriots. Right? Which is an expression, actually, that came from the American Revolution, when General Washington, because he had an all-volunteer army, found that the soldiers wouldn't come out in the spring and summertime because that's when they were planting their crops. Well, the British figured this out after the first year and started attacking in the spring and summer. So it's only when it's convenient. Okay. I think it showed a determination of people. But I think that what came through was that there was no coherent message. And what clearly came through is what I alluded to here in my speech, which was you can't change a government by just being against someone. And that's what the demonstrations were. They were portrayed as being anti-Putin. It could well be that you want something else. We have the same problem, for example, in the United States. The entire Republican Party is galvanized by anyone but Obama. Right? But they haven't actually said what they're going to do if their nominee is actually elected president. And that's why at the end of the day, I think they're going to lose the election, because people would rather know they can deal with the devil they know than the devil they don't know. And if you're not running with any positive formulas for change, why should people vote for you? So I think a lot of that came through. And the other thing which totally confused me and a lot of other people I spoke to was who the girl bands, Pussy something, were, and were they really the voice of your future, which is what I really would hope would come out in the discussion here. And I'd like to pose that question, if no one else does here. Who are the voices that you're listening to?
Коллега, слово прошу.
Mr. Makarov, from the Astrakhan region, you have mentioned that concessions are important for any negotiations, and you also mentioned that it is very important to live by one's word. What do you do if the Institute of Responsibility is not very developed, and who should really observe and supervise over the agreements to be fulfilled and implemented?
First of all, I think that I don't know if you're implying that external powers should be involved in supervising any agreements that are done. This is your country. You have to learn to supervise, your own issues and your own agreements. Responsibility, I believe, starts with the individual. You can't always throw off the responsibility by saying it's the government or it's society. The beauty, for example, of the American Declaration of Independence is that it starts with the phrase, "we the people." It doesn't say the government should do this. It says, "we the people." We are the government, right? Some of you, are just starting out, as local councilors or in the political process. Someday, hopefully, you'll rise to the top of the political pyramid and be prime minister or president. You have to start, the notion of responsibility starts with what we will assume ourselves and what we can expect of others and how they relate to us, okay? And as soon as you put that in the framework of the way you phrase your thoughts, people will begin to take you more seriously as an individual, because they'll be able to hold you accountable for at least the things that you promise, right? But you'll get nowhere if you expect someone else to take responsibility for your actions, right? And that's where the notion of trust is earned, right? You can't keep demanding things of people who aren't accountable for them in the end, because they're just going to shrug their shoulders and say, well, it's the system, it's not me, I'd like to go along with you. And you have to keep reminding each one of these bureaucrats that they are the government, right? It's the same notion as corruption. People think that the government can come in and just enact the law and wipe out corruption. It doesn't work that way. You look at places like China. China executes people corrupt officials. I had lunch with the mayor of Beijing 6 years ago. A year later was the Olympics. And 2 years ago, he had a bullet in the back of his head because he took bribes during the Olympics for the building of the stadiums. When their milk was contaminated, the guy who headed the dairy foundation there, the dairy corporation, was also executed for taking bribes to allow the manufacturers to dilute the milk. Okay? Each time a policeman stops you and asks another 100 rubles not to give you a ticket, you support that system. I know it sounds harsh. I know when you're denied a driver's license because you didn't pay a bribe or a student permit or something like that, you take a hit and you say, well, why should I do it? And the reason is, Alexandre de Tocqueville, the French philosopher and statesman, said, we are tyrannized by the amount we allow ourselves to be tyrannized. Right? We live in a corrupt society by the amount we're willing to pay the price for that. If each individual stopped paying the bribes, corruption would end. Right? So that's why I come back to the notion that we have to accept individual responsibility when we negotiate. We have to make a person believe that we're going to honor whatever commitment we make and not simply talk on someone else's behalf. And then when it's not honored, we say, well, nothing I can do about it.
Коллеги, я прошу вас больше не задавать вопросы, потому что...
Dear colleagues, unfortunately I can't take any more questions, but what we have time for is for a final remark of Igor Mintusov. Thank you very much, and my remark will be a short one. Thank you for this, but I couldn't help saying this. During the slides, the first slides, the great slides of Mr. Passa, there was an example of, and the words about the conditions of Mr. Yeltsin's retirement. The negotiations with Mr. Putin. As far as I know, there were no negotiations with Mr. Yeltsin or between Mr. Yeltsin and Mr. Putin. I would not like this myth to be perpetrated. I am not aware, and I do not think that there were any negotiations on the guarantees to President Yeltsin. I think this was a very interesting session, most interesting session, and a great start of the day. And I would like to thank you all and our esteemed speaker.